Hi, and welcome to Photo IQ. I'm your instructor, Gus Cantivero, and this is the Camera Basics module. In this unit, we're going to talk all about lenses. Let's get started. As you can see by the props on my desk, we are going to be talking all about lenses. And before we take one step further, let's talk about something that we all need to understand before we move forward. And that would be the names of the lenses. And what I mean by that is actually the focal lengths, the millimeters that we see on our lenses. We've all seen them before, 24, 35, 50 millimeter, and then there's zoom lenses, 18 to 55, 24 to 70. What does it all actually mean? Well, in short, the millimeters on the lens is the distance between the lens element and the sensor. And basically what that refers to is how wide or tight your field of view actually is. And by field of view, I mean what you can actually see through the lens. Now, the field and the angle of view are referring to the same thing. The field of view is sort of like a general term referring to what you can see, how wide you can see, what you can see. And then the angle of view is the specific measurement of the degree angles of the radius that you're actually able to see. Now, for just a rough measurement, and every lens is going to be slightly different from one to another, even sometimes amongst the same manufacturers, a 24 millimeter lens and another 24 millimeter lens may not give you precisely exactly the same image. And that is because there could be slight variations in the design of the lens or the size of the lens housing. One lens that protrudes further than another is actually going to be closer to the subject, and therefore it's going to have a smaller field of view. So a 24 millimeter lens approximately gives you an 84 degree angle of view, whereas an 85 millimeter lens is going to give you approximately a 28 degree angle of view. And as you can see by this illustration, I did not do this mathematically, so don't take this as the gospel here. But you can see the box refers to the camera, and then the red line is referring to the angle of view for the 24 millimeter lens. And then if it were zoomed out to 50 millimeter, that's approximately what you would see with a 50 millimeter lens. Now, to give you some image examples of what we're talking about, here is a wide-angle shot that I took of a yoga studio that was having a session on a rooftop garden. And you can see how wide the view is. It goes all the way from this guy's knee over here, all the way to the woman in the back with a brunette ponytail. And then it's even showing the grass, the umbrellas, the floor space, and even some negative space on the right-hand side of the image. Now, a 28 or lower millimeter number of lens is going to be considered a wide-angle lens. A 16 and under is going to be considered an ultra-wide, and these are rough terms. There's crossover in gray area, so if you were to call an 18 millimeter an ultra-wide, I don't think anyone's going to make fun of you for that. And then once you get down to the specialty fisheye focal length, it's going to be around an 8 millimeter lens. Now, moving into the middle range, we are talking about 35 millimeters and up. Okay, so the 35 to 50 is considered kind of a normal range, which is sort of a minimal amount of wide angle expansion and a minimal amount of telephoto reach. Okay, so this is very similar to what we see with our naked eye. So a 35 millimeter is considered a medium wide, 50 millimeter is considered normal, and that's very close to what we see with our eye, and that's why a lot of street photographers prefer to work with a 50 millimeter lens, because it's a very familiar focal length. 70 millimeters considered a short telephoto, 100 to 300 is the telephoto range, and then 400 and up is considered super telephoto. And those are the lenses that you'd be using for nature photography or shooting birds on a tree or sports on a big field, bigger than basketball, think football, lacrosse, soccer, things like that. But you can see the difference in how tight this image is as compared to the wide angle. So if we move forward one frame, you can see the 100 millimeter on the right side and the 24 millimeter on the left side. And it goes all the way from the guy's knee here all the way to the back wall versus the 100 millimeter where it shows this woman right here, that's her head and how large it is in frame and how it reaches all the way back to, let's take this woman the blonde right here, she takes up almost half of the entire frame. So you can see exactly how much you're reaching into the scene to pull out a subject and draw attention to what the photographer wants the attention drawn to. So you can see the difference in the artistic effect of why you might choose a telephoto lens versus a wide angle lens. Let's look at some of the terms that you need to know for this unit. The first one on the list is the aperture, or the f-stop. The f-stop is the actual number of the aperture setting. Okay, but they both refer to the same physical component, which is the iris inside the lens. So I can show you what it looks like if I take this lens, and this one is a manual lens, so I can manually open the iris for you. And if I open it all the way, you can see through the opening of the lens. And then if I close it down, you can see that it goes away because it's become really, really small. It's too small to actually see through at that distance. If I move it a little bit, I think you can barely see a little light coming through. So that is the component that controls two things: your depth of field, which is how deep your focus is, and how much light is being allowed into the camera sensor. Okay, so if I jump forward one slide, we'll come back to that list in a second. You can see on the bottom, this is the aperture chart, and I'll put this full screen for you so you can see it. Think of this as a fraction, okay? So if 2, and that would be referred to as f2, if f2 is basically like 1/2, okay? And then f22 would be like 1/22. So 1/22 is much smaller than 1/2, right? So 1/22 is going to allow in that much less light. Each of these is one full stop apart. One stop is a measurement of light. It's either half or double. So when you go up one stop, you've doubled the amount of light. When you go down one stop, you've halved the amount of light. So not only does the aperture control how much light is coming to the sensor, it also controls something called your depth of field, which is also referred to as your depth of focus, if you will. The depth of field is going to be how much front to back is going to be in focus, relatively speaking. Your exact focus point is a set number, but there's going to be a depth fore and back that is also going to be an acceptable focus. So let's say you're trying to focus on the eye, and you're using a very shallow depth of field. Well, you might actually miss and get it on the nose instead, and then the eye might actually be kind of soft. So when you're working with a very shallow depth of field, you need to double check your focus. Autofocus on cameras can even be confused sometimes and think that it has the focus, and it's actually focused on the nose, or it's focused on the ear, or just behind the eye, right here on the temple. And that's kind of because especially older autofocus systems can be easily tricked by these things, whereas newer ones are getting more and more precise. However, they still miss sometimes, and you really that's one of the reasons why I don't really rely on autofocus. If something is focusing on a foreground element like the nose or a background element like the ear, it's called front focusing or back focusing. Either it's focusing on something in the foreground or in the background, okay? If you are using a lens that has manual focus, then you're probably going to have something like this here, which is a focus scale, and you can see it large on the screen right here. And that is telling you how much in the foreground or background is in focus at your selected f-stop. And again, I go into this in great detail in a later unit. So what lenses do you have? Let's talk about prime lenses. Everybody, I think, knows the word zoom lens. That is probably one of the oldest terms of photography that is pretty widely known. Oddly though, an older term that most people don't know is a prime lens. And a prime lens is a single focal length lens. You cannot zoom it to get tighter or wider. So for example, this is a 23mm lens. This is an 16 to 55 zoom lens. So these are two different lenses. You can see off the bat the size difference, and I can tell you this is much heavier than this one. Now this lens is an f2.8, this is an f2, and if you remember from a moment ago with the aperture scale, f2 is wider than 2.8. So then why exactly is this one so much bigger? Well, because it has multiple focal lengths that it can cover. By zooming this lens, it needs to have that much more heavy glass in here in order to maintain a crisp image throughout the zoom range. That's one of the reasons why there are some very, very cheap zoom lenses out there, but they're not exactly quality. If you see one that's a very cheap zoom lens, like say $200, most likely it's going to suffer from a lot of image aberrations. And that could be soft focus, or it can be fringing, which is a green or magenta outline around backlit items, fine detail. So they're going to suffer, but they are giving you an advantage of the convenience of multiple focal ranges. So you would have to carry 5 or 6 lenses in order to cover everything that this lens can do. And in fact, I can tell you it would be because of the markings on the lens, it tells you sort of the main stops of where you would be with a popular focal length. So it'd be 16, 23, 35, and 55. Now the normal one is 50, but this goes just a little bit further for some crossover. So it would be 4 lenses that this lens is taking the place of. Now, an advantage of prime lenses is one, that they're much smaller, as I just mentioned. Another one is that they typically, well, pretty much always have wider apertures available than zoom lenses do. And that is basically because it becomes very expensive and difficult to manufacture a zoom lens that has as wide of an aperture as a prime lens does. So zoom lenses are always much heavier, bulkier, and often very expensive, especially if you're talking about a high quality one. On the flip side, inexpensive prime lenses can still actually be very, very good. And for example, this Canon 50mm f1.8, now f1.8, that's actually very, very wide, is only $125. That is a full frame lens. It will also work on your crop sensor Canon camera, and Nikon makes a very, very close competitor on the Nikon side. And in fact, all of the manufacturers make a inexpensive, usually a medium range, and an expensive version of the most common focal lengths. The lens on the bottom is an EFS lens, which is made specifically for crop sensor cameras, and that one is going to produce what's called a vignette if you were to attach it to a full frame camera. And a vignette is basically like a black halo around the outside of the image. This 24mm prime lens on the bottom is made for an EFS crop sensor Canon camera, and it is referred to as a pancake lens for obvious reasons, because it's actually extremely thin. Now, you may have some zoom lenses, and in fact you probably do, because zoom lenses are the most common kit lens that we see packaged with cameras when we buy them. So often when people go to buy their Canon Rebel or their Nikon 3500 or something like that, those cameras are going to come packaged with a zoom lens. So for example, we can see 2 alternatives here. One is the Canon kit lens. It's the 18 to 55. That is an EFS lens. It's designed for crop sensor cameras, and it is an f3.5 to f5.6 variable zoom lens, which means as you zoom out, it is going to stop down the iris. Now, versus a constant aperture lens like this one, this is also an EFS lens. It's a 17 to 55, so almost the exact same zoom range, but it is a constant f2.8 aperture. It also provides image stabilization. And you can see it reflected in the price. It's $829 versus $199. Now, that's actually very expensive for a cropped sensor lens from Canon. However, you are getting a very good image, you're getting image stabilization, and you're getting a constant aperture on your zoom. Now, this is an f2.8 constant zoom. This one, or constant aperture zoom, this is a Canon 24 to 70, and this is an f4 constant aperture zoom. And then this one is the Canon 70 to 200 with image stabilization, f4 constant aperture zoom. Now, Canon makes f4 and f2.8 versions of both of these lenses. So you're gaining one stop of light, one larger stop of aperture, and shallower depth of field to be able to separate your subject from the background. The drawback is a much larger price and the fact that it is going to be much larger in size and much heavier. So there are significant drawbacks to these pros and cons. You need to decide whether you want to spend the money and whether you want to lug around the weight and the size. And to be able to fit more stuff in my bag when I travel is worth it to me. I used to have the f2.8 versions and I sold them and bought the f4 versions so that I would be able to fit more stuff in my camera case when I fly. The variable aperture zoom is not necessarily a terrible thing. This is a variable aperture zoom. This is a Fujifilm 55-200, and it goes from f3.5 at the widest to an f4.8 when you're zoomed all the way out. However, the zoom range is quite far, 55-200, and you're not losing that much light when you zoom all the way out, so it's actually a pretty minor inconvenience. Now, on the opposite side, this Canon 18-55, that is not a long zoom range, and you're losing about a stop and a half of light when you go from 3.5 to 5.6. So you're not zooming that far, and it very rapidly closes down the aperture as you zoom out. One other thing just to know the difference of, and this again is not something that is a pro or a con, it's just something you ought to know. This lens is a zoom, and it's an internal zooming lens. So as I turn the zoom, the structure doesn't change, the size doesn't change. However, this one is not an internal zoom, so when I turn the zoom ring, you can see that it actually gets longer. The same is true for this one. As I turn the zoom ring, it actually protrudes from the end, and the same for this one. So these are all externally zooming lenses. Now, the downside to it is just that it physically protrudes. There's another downside in that the weather sealing is sacrificed in those areas. So when you are zoomed out and you're shooting out in the rain, water can build up in here. When you pull it back in, that water is brought inside the lens housing. So you want to be very, very careful to make sure that you have everything covered and wiped down nice and clean before you put it away. Do you need both? Well, no. The answer is obviously no. You only need what you want in order to accomplish the goal that you have. Whatever it is that you're interested in. Maybe you're only interested in wide-angle photography. You don't need a zoom lens at all. Maybe you're only interested in portraiture, so all you need is a nice 85mm lens or 100mm lens to be able to shoot nice portraits. That's really all that you require. If you want to be ready for every kind of scenario and you're building your interest in the different kinds of genres of photography, then it may actually benefit you to have more than one type of lens. Though, like I mentioned, this prime lens is so small, it's very easy for me to travel with. I can just carry it around with me. This is a 23mm crop sensor lens, which is the equivalent of around a 35mm in full frame terms. And that is a very general, widely used focal length, which I can use to take a portrait if I want to, or to take a landscape or astrophotography. And being f2, I can use it in low light, indoors, at night. It's going to give me a lot more versatility than, say, a zoom lens that stops down to an f5.6 when it's zoomed out. Other lenses I can show you, this is an 85mm lens for my Sony system, and this is an f1.8, so that's very wide. This Zeiss, this is the, which one is this? This is the 50mm, and this is an f2. Once again, it's very small, so it's a metal housing. It's very durable. It has weather sealing. I can travel with this one very easily to take some beautiful portraits or interiors or items I might find when I'm traveling. This is a 35mm lens. It's very similar. It's actually the sort of the from the same set as this 50mm, so the size of them is very comparable. Having a prime lens is not necessarily always small. For example, this is the Canon 50mm f1.2. and it's actually kind of big, and it's actually really heavy. So that's the downside to ultra wide aperture lenses. It's a 50 millimeter, which is versatile for a lot of different uses, but it's big and it's heavy. And this is really only used for my professional uses. I don't bring this around with me when I travel, unless I'm shooting stuff for portfolio type work. Generally, I don't bring this out of the house unless I'm shooting a job. That's partially because it's so expensive, and you can see it right here. It's so expensive, and it's large and bulky, and it gets very tiring to carry this around on a daily walk if you're going on a hike or something like that. I would almost always opt for a smaller micro prime version for my crop sensor camera or something like that. My Fuji is much more enjoyable to walk around with than a large Canon DSLR with a huge prime lens on it with a big wide aperture. However, there are benefits to both, and it's up to you to decide which one you would prefer to have. Let's say you have a kid playing sports. Well, you're probably going to want a long zoom like this 55-200, because that's going to give you a nice long reach to take some pictures across the field. Choose a camera that has really good autofocus. You're going to be able to get that really good action shots and have those great memories. Next, let's talk about image stabilization and why you may want it. What all four of these lenses have in common is that they all have image stabilization built in. Now, the one difference here is that this is the only prime. This is an 85 millimeter lens, which is really ideal for portraiture. And because it's a little bit of a longish focal length, they built in image stabilization into this lens. Now, these are all zoom lenses. They all have image stabilization, and they all have a physical switch on the outside to turn on and off the image stabilizer. This one does not have a switch on it, so some lenses may not have it, but it's going to be more of a rarity that they don't. I think it's more of just the unique minimalist design of this lens, because it's German and Zeiss, and they like things to be very sleek and special. So if it doesn't have it built onto the lens, it's going to be a menu option inside the camera. Now let's put this one aside because this is a little bit more of a rarity. These two actually, are going to be a longer telephoto range, whereas this one is the 24-70, and it's actually sort of a wide angle to a short telephoto zoom. It has image stabilization built in. They're also kind of thinking about the video user for this one. A wide angle lens does not necessarily need an image stabilizer because it's so wide, it's not going to be shaking very much. However, I use this on walking video shots or panning across sometimes when I'm handheld, and the image stabilizer works really, really well to stabilize that shot while I'm panning or moving around. So on these two, these are going to be more likely what you're going to use if you're going to be shooting, say, sports, youth sports, football or baseball, soccer, because the image stabilizer is going to give you the ability to watch and wait for the action to happen. So let's say you're waiting for the ball to get passed to your kids, so you want to keep it focused on them, and you just want to kind of follow them around. Well, you're going to get exhausted. First, try to get a monopod or something that's going to help to take the weight off of your arms, because you're going to get exhausted. But if you're watching through this long telephoto and waiting, holding your breath, you're going to see the image shake quite a lot, and it's going to make it really hard to focus on what you're seeing. The image stabilizer is going to keep it smooth so that you're able to actually focus on what you're seeing. It's also going to give you the ability to get sharper shots at slower shutter speeds. So in twilight hours or indoor sports like basketball, you're not going to be given that much light to work with. So you're going to have to slow your shutter speed down just a little bit, and the image stabilizer is going to help to compensate for that slower shutter speed and still keep your images nice and crisp. The last feature we're going to talk about is macro lenses. Now, some lenses have macro as their primary function, like say these two lenses. This is the EF-S 60mm, and this is the EF 100mm macro. Both of them are f2.8 aperture lenses, which is a nice wide aperture. This one is $469, this one is $599, and the main reason why they're different price is because this is a crop sensor lens and this is a full frame lens. At one time, I actually owned this 100mm macro, and I can assure you it is an excellent lens. So if you're trying to get into macro photography, then I would recommend that. This one is also going to be very good for you. A 60mm on a crop sensor camera is going to give you basically the same focal length as the 100. If you attach the 100 to a crop sensor camera, you're now going to be looking at about 160mm. Now on this Canon lens on the outside, that's actually this one right here. And the difference between this one and these is that in order to activate the macro function, you have to zoom out, and then there's a yellow ring here, and then you have to press up on this switch toward macro and then continue moving the lens to enter into macro mode. And then continue moving the lens to enter into the macro range. That is a bit wonky and a bit weird and not exactly convenient. It would be great if I could just keep on focusing closer and closer until you get to the macro range. However, because this lens is built to do so many different things, in order to get into the macro range, what they actually have to do is move the lens element further away. So that is how it is able to get this hyper close-up focal distance. Now, if you are interested in macro photography, here's a couple of images I shot just earlier today with this lens in preparation for this lesson. This is a couple of shots of the lavender growing in my garden, and you can see how beautiful it is to look at the flowers close up and the details that come out, such as this bug just hanging on the bottom of the flower. It's really cool, and it's a different perspective on the world. If you're into flowers, if you're into bugs or butterflies or things like that, then you should definitely look into macro photography because it may be something that you'll really enjoy. All right, that's gonna do for Unit 2, where we talked all about lenses. There's of course way more information than I can cover in just one unit, but I hope that this gives you a good introduction into what you can expect when you go out there and start using your tools. I hope to see you in the next lesson. Until then, keep shooting.